Yeah, so I'm Zach Penland. I'm the program supervisor here at the Sister Mary Alice Murphy Center for Hope, which we just call the Murphy Center for obvious reasons, though you guys might also sometimes hear it called as the Hope Center. There's a variety of names. And, you know, so, well, how many of you have actually been over here to the Murphy Center before? Everybody? Oh, well, I guess you've probably done trainings over here before. Okay, well, that's cheating. All right, who's familiar with exactly what we do here at the Murphy Center? Okay, that was more what I was expecting. So basically what the Murphy Center is a one-stop shop resource center where we bring as many resources into one place as possible to help anyone who is homeless or near homelessness. So that's why it kind of made sense for us to help out with this training when Rick came up with the idea that, you know, he thought some of you might like some additional information on not only what resources are available, but also kind of what is some of the process in terms of accessing those resources, because that can sometimes be just as important when you're talking to people, knowing what the process is as well as what the actual resource is. So that's kind of why we're here doing this today at the Murphy Center. So we got a couple of folks joining us, and we're going to keep it pretty informal and try to answer questions and all that kind of stuff. We have Jim Cox from the Fort Collins Housing Authority. What's your official title over there now?
Homeless Services Coordinator.
Okay, I should be able to remember that. And Barb Jensen, who's our lead case manager here at the Murphy Center, so she actually knows much better what the resources are than I do, so I definitely wanted her to be here, even though she is in preparation for an art show at the Art Museum this Friday, and she's been very gracious to give us a little bit of time, even though she's very busy right now. And then Beth, I'm sorry, your last name? Brunel. And you are from the You Count program at Timberline Church, is that correct? And could you describe exactly what that is? Well, not exactly, but a very brief description of that.
Very briefly, the You Count campaign at Timberline Church is a team of volunteers focused on ending global human trafficking. That's it in a nutshell.
Which I think is, you know, very important. I mean, I'm not sure if you guys have been coming across people who have been, you know, part of the trafficking trade, but we actually have started to see an increase in that here at the Murphy Center. So I think it's great that the community is actually getting ahead of the curve and actually trying to address that issue before it gets too widespread. So, I mean, I think tonight we're going to, you know, again, keep it pretty informal, go over a few kind of topics that that Rick had emailed some of you and to see what you might be interested in learning a little bit more about, and then, you know, open it up for question and discussion. I mean, we don't only have to keep this focused on resources, but also, you know, if there's situations that you've had to deal with while you're out doing outreach that you would like, you know, maybe our 2 cents on how you could have handled that situation. I mean, Barb here, you know, she handles fairly major crises here at the Murphy Center on a regular basis. I don't know if a week goes by that we don't have an ambulance or a police call over here, so she's very familiar with how to handle those situations. So, you know, we'd also be more than willing to kind of help give any advice in terms of how to handle difficult situations as well. So I guess to start, kind of the handouts that we were passing around, I know it's kind of a random collection of different information, but the reason we're passing that around is to give you a sense of some of the resource lists that we're giving to individuals when we work with them. And then another piece that we put in there was the Murphy Center intake packet. You know, I think one of the things that's always good to, yes, that one, with the checklist on top. One of the things I think that's always really important when you're referring people to different resources is to understand exactly what somebody is going to have to go through to access those resources. And, you know, at the Murphy Center, we really pride ourselves on being as welcoming as possible and trying to make it as easy as possible for people to access resources. Yet you can see that we still ask people to fill out, you know, it's 5-6 page application to access services at the Murphy Center.
I think it's more than that.
Maybe even more than that.
Yes, because now
With
there's-
releases
Right.
and, you know, all kinds of different things on there. So, you know, I mean, that's one thing to definitely keep in mind as you're talking to folks about resources. And, you know, at times there may be frustration of, well, why hasn't somebody, you know, already accessed these resources? And frankly, even though Fort Collins has gotten significantly better about streamlining how people get services, it's still not easy. You know, I mean, Barb can tell you that she's here 40 hours a week and all she does is help people access resources. And there are times that she gets confused about what resources, you know, what agency does what program does what. So expecting somebody who has a serious mental health issue or a serious substance abuse issue, or is just simply in a major life crisis and has never had to access those resources before, expecting them to know how to navigate the system really is unfair. And that's, you know, a big part of where you all come in, is not only having that initial contact, but giving them, even if nothing else, a little bit of emotional support in terms of encouragement or making them feel a little bit more at ease, you know, being able to say, I've met people from the Murphy Center, they're, you know, even if it isn't true, they're really nice, you know, trust me, go over it. Yeah. We may be horrible, but just lie and say we're great people, and it'll increase the chances that they show up over here. So those are just some things for you guys to look through, and you definitely don't have to keep all of them. And I know that Rick and Ken and everybody has done an amazing job creating the resource binders that each outreach team has, and you know, I would definitely use that as a reference. But I think that this is just kind of gives you a sense of, you know, some of the different resources that are out there, and kind of what some people have to go through to access those resources. So with that, why don't I go ahead and turn it over to Jim so that he can give you a little bit more detail about the Fort Collins Housing Authority, and then we'll get back into the Murphy Center and some of the other services available in the community.
Okay. Well, hello. So happy you guys are here. It's really quite amazing that Ken and Rick have put this together, that you guys signed up. For those of us that are professionals working in this field and providing services, or trying to provide services as best we can to our homeless, to have this volunteer set up initially, I just want to say thank you so much. For those of you that know about our Project Homeless Connect last week, to be a professional and to see volunteers from the schools, to see people like yourself beginning to say, I want to help, is a very powerful statement for those of us on the other side. So I just want to say thank you so much for that. So, okay, so I'm going to assume nothing about your knowledge of the housing system, and I want to give you like a real super fast crash course about sort of how the Housing Authority works and what their programming is. And then, as Zach mentioned, I think, and I talked to Rick ahead of time before this meeting tonight, I think in terms of understanding like how to get access to our system is probably the most important thing for you to know when you're on the streets and somebody says to you, I just need housing, man, how do I get there? I mean, what are the steps? So I will talk just as briefly as I can about the overview. I brought this big PowerPoint presentation, and I forgot my flash drive. I brought out my equipment, and I talked to Rick, and I said, well, you know, I really don't need to have a flash drive because we're scrapping the whole thing. We're going to do something different. So, and it's much more on what you need practically speaking. So I also want to talk a little bit, besides what we're doing at the Housing Authority on a general basis, about a very exciting program that we are just rolling out today. Rick was at our meeting, bringing the community together around a very special project that we've been working on for a couple of years, and it's finally getting off the ground. So we'll talk about that as well. Okay. Federal subsidized, our housing authority basically works in 3 different areas. And it's confusing to people that have worked there for 9 years, sometimes, about what this is about. So public housing is, and Section 8 housing are things you might have heard. And they are subsidized by the federal government. You have to be income qualified for both of these kind of programs. And when you get into that kind of programming, those kind of housing setups, there is a subsidy where you pay 30% of your total income toward your rent. And the federal government basically pays the remainder. I mean, there's no penthouses included, but there's a ceiling as to how the rent goes. But if you're income qualified, and I mean, every single person you're seeing on the streets is qualified. All right? So public housing is, we have about 154 units of public housing. We also monitor and administer another 48 units in the Wellington Housing Authority. Public housing is kind of on its way out. It was brought into in existence and started having its heyday really around the 1930s. And we basically bought properties that are a lot of, at this point, fast forward, 70 years, 80 years, is not real efficient in terms of, it's very expensive to keep it up, and we can't get as many folks into these houses because they're single dotted houses, mostly on the north side of town here. So we're kind of moving our way away from that kind of housing, but there is a wait list for that housing that you can sign up for, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. We also have Section 8 vouchers. And Section 8 vouchers are, we're calling them now housing choice vouchers, but most people know about Section 8 vouchers from the 1970s. And essentially what that is you have and we have a couple different kinds, but I'll give you sort of the general headlines, which is you have this subsidy and you can go out to a private landlord and work a deal, kind of a three-way deal between the housing authority, yourself, and the landlord. And if they're interested in this kind of a three-way partnership, the subsidy will be provided directly to the landlord, and the tenant will pay 30% of their income. And the housing authority basically does the administration. We have, at this point, I believe about 800 or 1,000, let's see, let me check and see here. We've got about 1,100 of these vouchers in town at this point. And there's 100 of them are in the county, the rest of them are in the city. So the wait list on that at this point has been closed for a number of years. There's something called project-based Section 8, which is our way for folks to finally get into this transferable portable voucher that you can really take any place in the country. It's kind of the Cadillac of subsidized vouchers. We don't have a wait list for that right now. And instead, we have about 85 what we're calling project-based or unit-based Section 8 vouchers. They're in our larger portfolio of real estate. They are dotted through the real estate. You come into the housing authority and you put yourself on a wait list on that one. And when you get to the top of the list and you qualify, you can then go into a selective unit through us. You can't take that voucher and just go anyplace. You have to go to our units. You're there for a year and successfully get through that. Then you have an opportunity to get on what is otherwise a closed list for the Cadillac vouchers. Okay. A lot of people will say, well, I know something about Section 8. Can I go to Section 8? We don't have an opening there, but we have this other sort of workaround way to get into that particular process. When you're in project-based Section 8, you can stay there for a year and leave and get on this wait list. Most people say, well, gee, I'm getting a subsidy. I'll stay here until I finally get to the top of the Cadillac list. Okay? All right. So there is also something called single-room occupancy. And for your folks who are on the streets, most of whom are single, we have had 3 different locations and 52 units. We just lost one of those in the last year, and now we're down to 37 units. There is a wait list for that. There is some turnover, typically about this time of year, after the winter, people start thawing out and there's nicer weather, people move on. So there's some turnover right now. It typically has a seasonal sort of feel to it in terms of people moving and people staying. We have 2 places in town. First Street, which is on First and Buckingham near New Belgian Brewery, and another place that's over at 811 East Myrtle, near Myrtle and Riverside. And there is full-time resident managers and case management tied into folks who are coming off the streets into those 2 houses. And that's a separate wait list, certainly important for you. It's probably one of the shorter wait lists. These other 2 first ones I mentioned to you, public housing and project-based Section 8, are multi-year wait lists at this point. Single room occupancy, probably a year or somewhat under, depending on what we've got. That also is a subsidy where you're paying 30% of your income. If you don't have any income, you don't pay anything. We typically, there's a minimum rent that's expected, but we can kind of work around that with the request, so that's not a problem. Okay, and then finally, just FYI, and it's not really relevant to your population, but we have a very large affordable housing portfolio. And affordable housing is not subsidized housing. Essentially, it's working with a private-public partnership of investors where we draw together the development stuff, talk to investor groups that come in, and on a tax, they get a tax break for giving money to us to help work on providing affordable housing. It's not a subsidy, but what happens is because of these investment arrangements, the rent structure is lower than the typical rent structure around town. So what you're typically working with is folks who've got either that are working poor, because they have to have a minimum income to qualify. And again, for most of the folks that you're seeing that are chronic homeless, that is not going to be an option for them at all. There's no wait list necessarily for that. You can, it's a landlord property management kind of an arrangement, just like anybody else in town. You just go in there and find out, is there something available, and credit background checks, etc. We have some more liberal kind of policies, and certainly, again, rent structure down lower. But even folks that have got like Social Security and supplemental security income typically are not really able to get into those places because of the because of the minimum income. There might be some folks on Social Security disability income who've had a whole lifetime of work and then got disabled, who have enough, enough of an award that they could get into that. But again, many of the folks that you're working with probably are quite a ways away from that. But I just want to let you know that. Okay, so I'm going to stop for a second and breathe. We have some senior housing as well. The Northern Hotel here is one of our senior housing complexes, and 48 units, I think, or so of senior housing. You have to be 55 and above to qualify for that. It's a multi-year wait list. If you have people that are 52 years old, put them on the wait list. Or 53, you should get them on the wait list ahead of time, so they may be, just about at the top of the wait list at the time that they turn that 55. Okay, so those are the main pieces, I think, about what is the Housing Authority up to. And then I want to talk a little bit about our special project, and that's permanent supportive housing. Bryce Hawk in the back of the room, who works with Homeward 2020 as executive director, has been in consultation with this city and with all of the people who've been working here in this area for a number of years, and has basically convened a conversation and brought all the players together about what our needs are for chronically homeless, the people that you're working with, and the fact that we have not nearly the number of units available for folks. Traditionally, folks chronically homeless were coming into our shelter systems, and government money was being put into transitional or shelter arrangements. And essentially there's been a shift now to taking folks and skipping all the middle places, which oftentimes never gets to people to permanent housing, and just move right to permanent housing. There's federal money for this, and we are happy enough to announce that we have some of that. And over the last, again, several years, there's been some movement through some understandings and some working. A lot of the work that Zach and his staff have been doing, the mental health center and their staff, we've come to conclude that a congregate living arrangement for our chronically homeless is really a way for this community to make a big dent in this population. So, the executive director of the agency, Julie Bruin, along with many other people in the community, have moved forward toward getting financing for a building. We, just this week, are announcing the location and that we're going to put a 60-unit housing complex together. And it's going to be probably opening up its doors within the next 15 months or so. It's going to be south Fort Collins. It's going to be in the Red Tail Ponds area, which is just south of Spradley Bar Ford on College Avenue. The new Mason Corridor Transit Center on the south end of the city is going to be within walking distance of this, this facility. It's on a bike path, and a lot of our folks are on bikes only. We're really thrilled about that as well. We are also, when we talk about permanent supportive housing, many of the folks that you see have got multiple disabilities at once, and you know that. They got mental illness, they've got substance abuse, and they oftentimes have health issues, significant health issues as they're getting older, oftentimes because of the first two issues that are just grinding their bodies down. And most, particularly as they get older, you're seeing all three, right? To house folks like that with those kinds of levels of need does not mean they can make it necessarily on their own independently in an apartment without some significant wraparound services. So the proposal is that we get a wraparound services staff that's staffing the place 24 hours a day, that has case management tied into it, that's got all sorts of other services from the traditional homeless services and advocacy community to come in to help us. And again, just this morning we had a meeting with Bryce, Zach, and others about, and Rick representing homeless care, to begin to talk about what can be given to our project and what we can provide to each of the agencies that's involved with this as well. So, what does that mean for y'all? The targeting population that we're really looking for are the people that you're meeting. The people that you're on the streets meeting that are very isolated and out there dealing with all these issues really have some potential hope for getting permanent placement. Not transitional, not shelter, but permanent placement. So we are so thrilled about this in our community, and we see this as a step and the possibility of more of these kinds of arrangements up ahead over the next 5 years or so. So one of the things I would offer to you is that each of you are like a little ambassador and an advocacy and a community educator for us about this project. Many people, as you know, have some very, very biased ideas about the homeless population and what they are and what they aren't. And oftentimes I think you're going to have a great education about, you're going to be able to be a great educator for the community, and I really ask you to be part of our team that way too. So, okay, access and how to draw into the system here. So let me talk a little bit about that when we're done. Then I'll ask. First of all, do we have any questions?
You all have all those programs memorized, references.
There's also have quizzes.
Yeah. So there's basically three, right? There's public housing, there's this vouchered Section 8 housing, and then there's this affordable housing, right? That's a simple three. And underneath some of the subsidized stuff, we've got this single room occupancy program, which I happen to run, or it's running me, one of the two probably. But, and now we're going to try this permanent supportive housing. And by the way, permanent supportive housing is subsidized. So again, as you're out there looking at folks, thinking about what they can do and so forth, the word is you're paying 30% of your total income. If you don't have any income, we're paying the whole thing for you, and you can come to our place. We just got a $250,000 grant to cover staff inside of this building, and renewable every year kind of indefinitely. And we are so thrilled with that amount of money to be able to provide those kind of heavy-duty services up front for very high-needs kind of folks. So that's the headlines. Any questions about those things before we move on to talking about the mechanics of how to get signed up? No? Oh man, these people are awesome. Okay, so let's see. There are probably, I was talking to Rick beforehand, there's probably like a half a dozen major connectors for access into our housing system, right? Agencies in town. And the Murphy Center happens to be a huge one. Well, first of all, there's us, right? And you can have somebody come directly to the Housing Authority. The location is on our website. It's Taft and Elizabeth. We have a place that is our property management. You can't miss it. It's right there, just north of Sri Thai restaurant on the east side of Taft, just north of Elizabeth. And you can fill out a wait list form to get on all these various wait lists. I think for our homeless community, it's been very patently clear that doesn't work too well. I mean, people just don't go over there. It's like, huh, what? And by themselves, forget it. It just doesn't work very well. So it is the ambassadors for homeless advocacy in the community that really are the folks that are helping us with helping folks to get access in. Nobody can step into the housing authority and get housing overnight. There's no emergency housing for us. There's always going to be a wait list. And there's a selection process when you get to the top of these wait lists that includes a number of federal hoop jumping exercises, okay? And for the folks that you see out there, their level of patience, skill, capabilities, et cetera, no way. And so the homeless advocates, those folks like yourself, are the folks that are going to be the ones that are going to help steer our folks along, all right? So I'm going to list a few people, a few places where these, when you're talking to folks and saying, well, who are you working with? I think that's a really important thing. And if you're not working with anybody, maybe we can hook you up with X, Y, and Z. And you guys can help me with that right now as well. But I want to start with the Murphy Center, because I don't even think that our agency necessarily is the place, although you can certainly say it's the housing authority, but the access to a comfortable place to come and get day services and understand a little bit more about the housing authority is right here with these folks. So essentially, there's a waitlist form, and the form is about 4 pages, and it's relatively simple. Your basic information, and there's a couple of other documents that are not absolutely critical immediately, but would be helpful, okay? There was a time up until a few months ago where we insisted until you have a social security card and a picture ID, you really can't, we were not going to take your application. Well, we've changed that policy. We're trying to break down some of these hoop jumping barriers that get in the way. Particularly, a lot of it has come from working with the homeless folks that are on the streets. So what we are trying to do is to get folks to bring those 2 documents in with them. And if you can, and you might want to see if that's possible. Excuse me, I guess my time's up. But we have a waitlist form. And the waitlist form is filled out, and it has to get over to our office on Taft, okay? And essentially, we've got folks in the jail. There's a social worker, Christy Cotter, who works in the jail, who is helping us by, she's got the form, and she's helping folks fill it out in the jail. Zach and his staff, Barbara, all those folks have got the same forms, and they're filling those out. and faxing them to us, faxing them or emailing them to us as well, okay? Disabled Resources in town is another place with folks who've got disabilities. If they have any connection over there, they're doing the same thing. All of the criminal justice systems, probation office, parole office, community corrections, have got contacts and they've got the forms digital and they can fill it out. Or else if they don't have them, they'll know who to talk to inside of the agencies. And Catholic Charities, the mission. You know, Kim Larson and her crew have got, again, we're working with them quite a bit. And help me, who else? I think those are the major players.
Neighbor to neighbor also.
Yeah.
Steve will do
There you
housing
go.
counseling with people and help
There you
with
go.
applications. So there's a lot of places where if people aren't good with the paperwork, and I'm going to talk with you about kind of the process and what people go through a little bit, there are helpers. So
There you
good
go.
to know.
So I think in your case, trying to begin to talk to folks about who could help, how to get stepped into that, and the fact that it's as simple as one very relatively short document. And you really do not at this point need to have the official Social Security or picture ID. When you finally come up on the top of these lists, you're going to need that. Second of all, we have a big issue because the lists need to be updated, and we do that probably every like 3 times a year. If you don't have a permanent address that we can send things to you, this is all again dictated by Housing and Urban Development, you're knocked off the list. And many of our folks that are homeless have got a huge issue. So essentially, when you talk to folks about trying to get on these lists, they've got to have some kind of an address. Well, they don't have one. But there may be people like the Murphy Center who could be a stand-in address for them. That is very, very important. I know that, you know, Zach has been extremely helpful in terms of providing assistance in that regard. Not only providing the address, but also alerting folks once we send out these documents to try to find folks, because there's a 2-week turnaround time. They have to respond to say, I still want to be on the list. And if not, they're gone. And you know, when you're waiting a year and suddenly you have a year to go and you're halfway there and suddenly you're gone just because you're addressed, that's a huge, huge issue. But it's, again, mandated by the federal government. So.